The newsroom. A new kid rode into Brussels this Wednesday by train. François Hollande took the train from Paris, the newly elected French leader, leaving the presidential plane behind for the 90-minute ride. His way of showing that change is afoot, what with Greece on the brink, with markets tanking, the euro at its lowest level against the dollar in nearly 2 years. Little did he know the EU summit, by the way, would run over and he'd have to return in the pre-dawn hours by car. But still, he was very much the star attraction. Yes, Germany's chancellor, though, sticking to her guns, rejecting the concept of Eurobonds, but Angela Merkel flying back to Germany, perhaps more isolated than before, with the anti-austerity crowd emboldened, but yet again, the ball is in Berlin's court. Today in the France 24 debate, we're looking at Merkel's next move. And with us to talk about it is Thomas KLAU of the European Council on Foreign Relations. Thanks for being with us. SHAHIN, VALLEE economist from the visiting fellow at Bruegel, the Brussels-based economics think tank. Thank you for being with us. And Ronald Freeman of the Atlantic Council, who spends part of his time in London, part of his time in Moscow these days. The France 24 debate, where you can always weigh in on the conversation, and you have on Facebook and on Twitter. You can find us at François F24. When Nicolas Sarkozy was president of France, he'd begin summits by first meeting privately with the German chancellor, and sometimes conclude them with joint press conferences. There was no such asides this time. François Hollande stressing la différence with Merkel, most notably over the pooling of debt through the creation of Eurobonds.
De la part de l'Allemagne,
for now, Germany's line of thinking is that Eurobonds, if I give the most optimistic version, that Eurobonds could only be an endpoint, whereas for us, they are a starting point. That's what I can say about today's positions.
Your reaction, Thomas KLAU, to the way François Hollande handled his first Brussels summit and to the remarks he makes there?
Well, he handled it very well. He certainly scored a major success with the media. Angela Merkel kept her press conference extremely short. She was speaking in front of largely empty rows of chairs. François Hollande's press conference was crowded, unsurprisingly. It was his first European summit, after all. And he spoke for an hour. And he has been served by circumstance. He garnered quite a lot of support for his push for Eurobonds. And of course his call for injecting more growth friendly policies into the Eurozone's policy mix is really helped, if you like, by economic circumstance. Growth, particularly in the so-called periphery countries, is doing worse than many people expected at the beginning of the year. And so rather than François Hollande being isolated with a call for growth and a reorienting of the Eurozone, politically speaking, as some people predicted 2 months before the election, we now have a scenario where it's Angela Merkel who looks much more isolated than François Hollande.
Perhaps looks isolated, but, and you're right, the German chancellor didn't stage a big press conference, but still, she did seem to be the one that she's going to be the one that everyone's looking at now, as she made her remarks before leaving Brussels.
There was a debate on Eurobonds. I explained the German position, which is that we need a strong economic coalition in the euro area. We had difficulties when we created the fiscal pact. It was difficult to implement within the scope of the treaty.
Difficult within the scope of the treaty, but she says it has to conform to reality. SHAHIN, VALLEE. For now, she's still holding firm.
She's still holding firm, although I think we tend to caricature a bit the German position on Eurobonds. Effectively, what the Germans are saying is that they don't want Eurobonds now, and they want Eurobonds at the end of a process of both political and economic integration, and in particular budgetary integration, which we haven't done so far. So I wouldn't say that that Germany is fundamentally opposed. I think it's setting a number of conditions, of preconditions. One being, move towards a form of political union, which is something that Germany has actually been calling for a long time, and which European partners have largely ignored. And the second is a move towards a closer fiscal union. Germany at the moment tends to sum up fiscal union by fiscal discipline, and I think this is a wrong way of looking at it. Fiscal union is much broader and much deeper than just fiscal discipline. But I think if both France, Italy, and say in general European partners are showing some willingness to move towards fiscal union and to show some signs of willingness as well to move towards a form of political union, I think that should help greatly Germany to move towards a Eurobond position. So I think the positions are not categorical and they're not as antagonistic as they are presented. I think there is a room and there is path for an agreement, but I think it requires every country to do a little bit.
What about on the style of the way things were handled? Again, the old Merkel'sy way of doing things was the two of them, Angela Merkel and Nicolas Sarkozy, would basically iron everything out before they met the 25 other heads of state. Yeah. Do you like the way things went Wednesday evening?
Well, I think it's more respectful of how the institutions are meant to be working.
Even if it means airing your dirty laundry?
I don't think there was so much sharing of dirty laundry. I think we've seen worse in the past and we'll probably see worse in the future as well. There was probably a lively debate, a long debate apparently, because it lasted until the early hours of the morning. But effectively, I think the idea of, discussing and debating at 27 rather than hiring out everything at 2 beforehand, especially when we look at the mistakes that this has led to. In particular, you must remember the famous event of Deauville, for instance, where both Angela Merkel and Nicolas Sarkozy had ironed out a proposition which turned out to be disastrous. These things, I think, having a more concerted discussion is probably the right way to go, and it's in any case the way institutions are meant to be working.
Ronald Freeman, were you worried when François Hollande became president that this would all get a little bit more boring, that Sarkozy had somebody with a lot of flair? Here, Hollande, who campaigned as Mr. Normal, what are your thoughts on the way these summits are unfolding?
Mr. Normal has turned out to start out very well. His idea of Eurobonds is a reversal of the stagnation of Merkel'sy. They have finally understood among the Euroheads that when a patient is dying of asphyxiation, strangulation is not the remedy. Oxygen is. The Eurobonds will pump necessary investment back into the economy. You cannot have growth without investment, and growth is what Europe is dying for a lack of.
So why are they such a sticking point, these Eurobonds? Explain it to us.
Well, Germany has decided to think of itself as a victim, but it is no more credible as a victim than Goldman Sachs is as a victim. Germany happens to be the strongest credit. It's the strongest credit because its economy is dependent on exports. 1/3 of German GDP is exports. Why is Germany such a successful exporter? In addition to the excellence of its exports, the euro enabled the Germans to devalue the Deutschmark by calling it something else. If they have to go back to the Deutschmark, it'll be with a much more expensive currency and a big hit to the crucial exports which keep Germany growing. I think Germany, little by little, is going to come to see that its exports are going to countries that are being asphyxiated for a lack of growth. Germany needs to join them in collective action. Eurobonds already exist. It's not an invention. The European Investment Bank issues Eurobonds, jointly and severally guaranteed by all its European shareholders. The EBRD, the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, issues Eurobonds. The World Bank issues world bonds, all guaranteed by its shareholders. These provide necessary capital to banks. Banks then lend this capital to investors, and investors create growth. The Germans need to relaunch growth by taking their fingers off the throat of Europe and allowing new capital to come into the banks. They will trigger growth again.
Eurobonds pooling the debt, the way here that Ronald Freeman is describing it, it sounds like you don't even need to rewrite the treaties of Europe the way some have described it. Is it a simple thing to do?
Well, I don't think we're quite there yet. We might get there, particularly if the crisis gets worse. But if you look at the internal dynamics of the German debate, I agree with Shahin that the positions aren't as clear-cut as they're sometimes being depicted, and the opposition might not be as radical. But there is enormous hostility in Germany, particularly in part of the media, the published media, and the parts of the media that a conservative government or centre-right government that Angela Merkel will be looking at, the Bild-Zeitung notably, against the idea of mutualizing debt. Why? because, so the media narrative, this would make, of course, German debt much more expensive. Germany is now borrowing at historically low rates, at no cost practically.
2-year bonds, I think, are at 0%.
Exactly. And the popular narrative in Germany that this is a reward for the virtuous management of Germany's public finances and the success of its economy. And you have economists in Germany who've come up with calculations saying that Germany would have to pay tens of billions more every year if debt was mutualized. And that's an argument that hits home with part of the electorate. The other argument which people use to mobilize against Eurobonds is that they say this would tie Germany's fate in the long-term perspective to the unsound fiscal management of other countries. So if Germany were to agree to it, it could only agree to it in exchange for much tougher, much more centralization, much tougher common joint controls of national countries' individual fiscal behavior. So yes to Eurobonds, but only in exchange for much bigger transfer of sovereignty to joint institutions in Brussels. That's basically Angela Merkel's line. And of course, that's something which François Hollande hasn't answered so far. How much sovereignty would he be ready to give up in exchange for Eurobonds?
How much sovereignty? In its Charlemagne column on Europe this week, The Economist sees this all as an opening gambit. The paper writes, is it too soon to conclude that Franco-German relations have gone into deep freeze? There you see Hollande with he's got the Eurobonds gun there. He's saying perhaps Mr. Hollande, boosted by a successful trip to America, is setting out a tough opening position ahead of the June summit. Did you really get the sense this Wednesday that it was opening gambit time?
No, I think the drawing is also a caricature. Relationships between France and Germany are not frozen. They ought to be a bit complicated at the beginning. We're starting with two very potentially acrimonious discussions, one on growth, and I'll get back to this in a second. The other on Eurobonds, which is essentially forces to answer a fundamental question about the institutions we want, about the type of union we want. Effectively, what we have at the moment is a very incomplete monetary union. We've agreed to pool our sovereignty over money together, and this is what we did in 1991 with the Maastricht Treaty. But at the time, the political and legal arrangement was that we refused to pull together our fiscal sovereignty. I think what this crisis is bringing to the fore is that this construct is unstable.
I'm going to interrupt you there. Pooling the fiscal sovereignty.
Yeah.
What does that mean? Does that mean, for instance, everyone's got the same tax code? What does it entail for the ordinary citizen?
I think it entails two things. You can have a very decentralized fiscal union, and there are examples of that. Or you can have a very centralized fiscal union whereby, effectively member state would have something very close to a balanced budget rule, but there would be a much bigger federal budget. So there are two paths to achieve a fiscal union. One is to have a decentralized federal fiscal union whereby there is a very intrusive and a much higher degree of coordination when it comes to setting a fiscal policy. And the other way to do it is to have smaller national fiscal policies, but a bigger federal budget, which is close to what the US has. This is a debate that we should have had actually when we created the monetary union, that we decided not to have, and that we're forced to have now under duress. And I think this is essentially behind the question of Eurobonds, the fundamental question that we need to answer.
You say a more intrusive look in. So in other words, what you're saying is that either way, more fiscal unity means, for instance, that Brussels gets to look at the books in places like Athens.
Not only in places like Athens, in places like Paris, in places like Berlin as well. But we shouldn't see this as something that's wrong. I think it is wrong when it's done with an institutional and a democratic and a political framework that's weak, and this is what we have at the moment. I think if we move towards this very intrusive look into national budgets, we need to have democratic accountability of those who are actually doing the intrusion. This is what we fail to have at the moment, and this is what we need to work on.
Ron Freeman, do you think Europe's ready for this conversation, the one we're having right now?
I think it's very difficult to take countries as diverse as the European countries. Germany is 11 times bigger than Greece in GDP. It's more than 50 times bigger than Greece in exports. Greece has an economy dependent on tourism. Where do its tourists come from? Mainly from Germany. Germany, as a major exporter, is an exporter across Europe. A third of its exports go to European countries that are way out of kilter with the Maastricht criteria. We cannot ask countries as diverse as these to be identical in every possible economic measure. We can ask them to have a certain level of economic health, but they can't get there in a very tight time frame, and they can't get there while their banks are loaded with sovereign debt that needs to be centralized and the banks reliquidated. If we can have a period of time, we can get to what Germany wants, but we can't do it the first day. This is where President Hollande was so clever. He said Eurobonds are not the end point, which is what the Germans have been saying. They're the starting point. And Guido Westerwelle said yesterday in Le Monde, it's going to take years to fix this. Well, that admission coming from Germany indicates we have to start first by giving the patient oxygen and giving him time to recover. Then we can start lining them up according to various financial criteria, as in the January Fiscal Compact.
In The Independent, earlier this week, Dominic Lawson penned a column in which he said, leave aside that the German government has been told by its own constitutional court that it could never do such a thing. It would in any case be completely unacceptable to the country's own public. What you were saying earlier, Thomas KLAU, about some of the publications like Bild Zeitung, as it would be to any sovereign people in a similar position. If anything, Merkel has already gone far beyond what her electorate would have wanted in terms of guarantees. Is it as far as she can go?
No, I don't think so. The picture is mixed, because on the one hand you have strong resistance in parts of Germany's published opinion, and certainly in Germany's body politic, against going much further in terms of bailing out other countries, transferring sovereignty, extending help in one way or the other. But on the other hand, if you look at what's been happening in regional elections lately in Germany, in the last year and more, where of course the vote was mainly about regional issues, but where there was inevitably some national and European component, you realize that the one party that's trying to capitalize on the electorate's supposedly anti-EU sentiment, the Liberals, have on the whole been doing very badly. The Greens and the Social Democrats, who've criticized the government for not extending enough solidarity in Europe, have been doing quite well. And the expectation that, as in other countries, a right-wing, anti-EU, xenophobic protest party would materialize in Germany hasn't been fulfilled at all. What has materialized is a protest party that focuses on the right of the internet citizen. So in that sense, the political environment, and particularly if you gauge it by the most important measure, which is voter behavior, doesn't look that bad in Germany. And you could imagine that, given the right circumstances, if Angela Merkel gets something in exchange for agreeing to Eurobonds, and if the Eurozone crisis becomes so bad that there seems to be no other way to hold together than by going for a radical step like that, Germany might agree. But as long as Germany is not isolated, has allies, and as long as Germany thinks that the Eurozone can be stabilized without paying that price, which would necessitate Angela Merkel to take a fairly courageous step politically, then I think we're not going to see German movement. And
when we come back, we'll be looking at how the whole issue of growth has come home to roost in Germany. Stay with us. This is the France 24 debate.
The Cannes Film Festival, until May 27th, here on France 24.